I was thinking this week, as we come near to 4th of July, which is always a wonderful time, just getting some time off, maybe cooking out or spending some time with family and friends. But I was reflecting a bit at those who have come before us and the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf so that we can have the freedoms that we have, and not letting that go without pondering and considering. And I, as many of you know, I enjoy history, as I know many of you do too. And there's always these neat stories about our history, about the history of our country, and one of them. I don't know if you know this, but the amount of involvement in the American Revolution that was had by ministers, that there was a significant, very significant role that pastors and ministers had in the American Revolution, and to the point where the British actually referred to the American Revolution, they called it the Presbyterian Rebellion, because it was being spearheaded by a lot of pastors. And there was even such a thing, maybe some of you have looked into this, called the Black Robe Regiment, which was a group of ministers and pastors who were sort of a unified spirit in dealing with some of the oppressions and so forth that they were facing. And there was one story in particular, and the minister's name escapes me at the moment. But there was in one of the battles, a rather decisive battle, that the Americans found themselves in, and they were actually in a pretty good position in this particular battle, and they were as far as numbers, tactics, and some other strategic factors, they were going to win this battle, except for the fact that they were running out of one thing that they needed, and that was wadding paper for muskets. They were running out of it. And if you know anything about muskets, without that back then, they don't work. You can't keep the ball in the musket, and that's a problem. And so they needed this wadding paper, and they couldn't have it. They couldn't get any more. And they had enough powder, they had enough projectiles and everything. But because of this one lack, they were going to lose this fight. And so the commander of that, who was actually also a pastor, and many of the people fighting under him were his congregants, he realized that he was not too far, that battle was not too far from his home church. And so he rode back as quick as he could, and he started grabbing armfuls of hymnals. And so he rode them back to where his guys were. And at the time, you have to understand that many of the hymns at the time, one of the popular hymn writers was a man by the name of Isaac Watts. And so he's riding back, and he starts tossing out these hymnals to his men. And while he's doing that, he tells them, he says, "Give them Watts, boys, give them Watts." And so they were tearing the pages out of these hymnals and using it for musket wadding, and it worked, and they won from that. But I just, in times like this, when we reflect back a bit, one thing that you would see in studying that whole, everything about that, the American Revolution and things leading up to it and the aftermath and so forth, there was, and they referred to it as providence. They saw that God had his hand in so many of these things, because so much of the odds that they were facing were virtually impossible. So as we celebrate this week, take the time to remember, and ultimately to be thankful, knowing that all good things, everything that we enjoy, is from God, ultimately. It's given by him. And so let us remember that and consider that this week. We're going to be finishing up in John chapter 17 this morning. And we looked at the same passage last week, except we focused more on the first half of it, verses 20 to 23. We're going to be focusing primarily on the last portion today as we wrap up. And again, let's take a moment to remember, this is the prayer of Jesus just before his arrest and trial, if we could call it that, and execution. And we get to peer inside of the Godhead, and we get to see a conversation that's taking place between the Father and the Son. And it's really, really a magnificent thing as we just step back and consider what it is that we're seeing and dealing with here. Jesus is praying for a few things. Last week we looked at his prayer for unity, which was one of the main things that he was desperately praying for his, not only for his immediate apostles, but also for the subsequent movement of Christianity that would follow, that he knew would follow. He was praying for unity among them and subsequently for us. And then he is asking for something else here. And when I say this, as I was jotting down my notes, I put here, this is another request that Jesus made. This is a prayer request by Jesus, which is kind of an odd thing to think about and to say, right? That Jesus had prayer requests. But he did. And of course, this is a bit, in some ways, very unique from us, and we're going to talk about that. But as I was considering that, there's a verse in the book of James chapter 5, verse 16. And I'm going to focus on the latter portion of it, but I'll read the whole thing here. It says, "Confess your faults one to another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." And that statement, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. I was thinking about that, and this is, by the way, if you've ever engaged in very, I'm going to say very desperate pleading prayer, this is something that is just unbelievable to consider, that God would allow himself, you could even say, allow his mind to be changed, if we can think of it along these lines. And I was thinking about this when you consider Abraham, when he is negotiating with God, remember, for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he says, well, what if there's 50 righteous? What if 40? What if 30? And there's this exchange between him and God, and the fact that God is allowing himself to be convinced almost, which is an incredible thing. That God would not only listen to us, incline his ear to us, but he would allow himself maybe to change or to alter. Now, you could step back and say, well, maybe God knew that was going to happen anyway, so this was his plan. Yeah, perhaps. Yes, because of course he would know. But here, such an encouragement, the fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And it does. That doesn't mean that everything that we ask for, God says yes to. That's not what that means. And as I was considering this, if the fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous man availeth much, how much more so the Son of God himself praying for this? The Son of God making this request from the Father regarding us. And not only is he desperately praying for this, but he is praying for it in the midst of carrying it out. So he's not just standing back and saying, whoa, these people are in a real mess, so I'm going to pray for them. And I'm going to just leave it there, right? Hopefully somebody can do something to help them. And sometimes Maybe sometimes we're tempted to do just that, to fall into this place of, maybe this person I work with, they need to hear about Jesus. I'm going to pray that someone tells them about Jesus. And yes, do that. But what else ought to be done there? Right? I'm just going to outsource it. I'm going to tell God that, hey, you need to call somebody forward to carry this message. And really, I find that, if we ever pray for something that we ourselves have been commanded to do, maybe God is less inclined to listen to that. If we say, oh, this person needs to hear about Jesus, well, yes, amen. And as I was considering this, again, Jesus he is doing it. He is carrying this out. And as he is giving up everything so that we as human beings can be unified once again with the Father, and that we can be unified with one another. And then also he is praying for that we would share in his glory, which is just an astonishing thing to consider. He's not just saying these words. He's not just praying for it, but he is in the middle of making this a reality. I was reminded of Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is given this vision where he is taken up into the throne room, into the presence of God. And he's actually, let's take a moment and turn there and look at this. Isaiah chapter 6. This is the calling of the prophet Isaiah. And before we go ahead and turn there, it's the very beginning portion of Isaiah 6. Before we dig into this, understand something about Isaiah's calling. His calling, and he willfully accepted it here, was to preach to a people that for the most part was going to ignore him. That his preaching was for the most part going to fall on deaf ears at the time. And yet, he did it anyway. He did it anyway. He was willing to go ahead with it regardless. Because he saw from this experience here that this is worth everything. And so, and we often have heard I'm sure you've heard the saying, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing well, right? That's what we say. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And yes, I understand that. That means whatever you find yourself doing, right? What does the Bible say? Do it heartily as unto the Lord, right? Whatever you find yourself doing, do it well. Do it to your best ability. But how about this idea? If something is worth doing, it's also worth failing at. Because if you've ever started doing something brand new, and it's not a fun thing, you're not going to be good at it. As a matter of fact, you might be really terrible at it. Why would you keep doing something that you're terrible at? Well, if it's worth doing, that's why. If it's worth doing, then keep failing at it. And that's how we learn. You fail at it, and over time you start failing a little less. And eventually you will improve. And this is hard for people like myself because I'm kind of a perfectionist. I'm kind of hard on myself. And so I don't like doing something that I can't excel at. So it's a good practice to jump into something that you are likely going to fail at and continue to fail at. But if it's worth doing, it's worth failing at. It's worth doing regardless. And so here, let me just read Isaiah 6, starting in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim stood above him, and each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another, saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold of the temple shook at the voice of him who called out. while the temple was filling with smoke. Then I said, Woe is me, for I am undone. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And so immediately, this experience that Isaiah is having, when he is in the near presence of God, he realizes something. He realizes that he is so far short of this glory that is before him. And he says, I am undone, for I am a man of unclean lips. And then he says, I live among a people of unclean lips. And he's not trying to diffuse the blame at all. What he's saying is, not only am I sinful, but I'm comfortable in it. This is normal for me. This is just typical, and this is the way that this is, and I'm okay with it. And then, in verse 6, then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. Then I heard a voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. He said, Go and tell this people. And then he gives him his commission. And this simple willingness that Isaiah had to intercede, to step in between God and his people and to carry this message forward. He wasn't, in this moment, he wasn't just saying, oh, I'm going to pray that somebody will do this. Right? He realized this opportunity and he stepped into that and he accepted that. How much more so then Jesus, as he is praying this prayer, is willing to perform what is necessary so that we might have what he is praying for. He's willing to do it all to get us. And so if we would focus our attention here, and I brought this out a bit last week, but I want to make this clear again. In verse 23, it says, I in them and you in me, that they may be perfected in unity, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you have loved me. And I emphasized here this concept of even as, that you have loved them even as you have loved me. And so the measure of love, if we can even begin to say that God has for the Son, the Father has for the Son, that is the measure of love that he has for us. For those who, as he said previously, for those who believe in the message of these disciples, believe on their word, even as you have loved me. And this, for point of reference, again, I mentioned this last week, but in verse 20, if you're skeptical at all in saying that, are you sure this is talking about us? Verse 20 makes it very clear that yes, this is talking about us. And I want to draw this out briefly so that none of us think in here, well, this is for this group of people or that group of people. John 17, verse 20. I do not ask on behalf of these alone, the these referring to his disciples there, but for those also who believe in me through their word. Which, that is, what is their word? Well, the New Testament, you could say. You could make the case that the ministry of the gospel is going forward because of the word of the disciples, that they are carrying this message forward, this gospel forward. And here we are 2,000 years removed, and we believe in Jesus because of that, because of their word, because they have brought that forward to us. So this very much includes us. Now, what is Jesus requesting here? Following unity, we talked about that last week, but he is also praying for, and let's read the last couple of verses here. In verse 23 through the end. I in them, and you in me, that they may be perfected in unity, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you have loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, be with me where I am, so that they may see my glory which you have given me. For you loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, although the world has not known you, yet I have known you, and these have known that you sent me. And I have made your name known to them and will make it known, so that the love which you loved me may be in them and I in them. Whew. Jesus is praying for that we would know the Father as the Father knows us. He's praying that we would see and know his glory. That we would take part in and be invited into and participate in the glory of the Father. And this is just an incredible thing if you consider this. There was a Scottish minister by the name of John Knox who was very instrumental in bringing the movement of the Reformation into Scotland. And on his deathbed, he asked his wife if she would come and read a passage of Scripture to him. And the passage that he asked to be read was John 17. As he is realizing that he is nearing the end of his life, he wanted to hear the words and thoughts of Jesus being poured out over him and for him. And that brought him a tremendous amount of comfort. And it ought to have. It ought to have. And it ought to bring that same comfort for us. If we look here in verse 24 more closely, look at what this says. It says, Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, be with me where I am. Now I'm going to stop there. A couple of things. First of all, notice that it says, I desire. This is Jesus talking. He desires that they also, whom you have given me, be with me where I am. Now, it's no wonder if we said, and if we expressed that our desire is to be with him, to be with Jesus, to be with the Father. I would expect that is of no surprise. That is our desire. This is unimaginable because this is the desire of Jesus for us. His desire is that we would be with him. That's what he wants. And that is incredible if you think about this. That this isn't just Jesus doing what the Father is telling him. There is that. But he himself desires that we would be where he is. And that's a fascinating thing to say. Does he mean that he desires that all of us were with him in Jerusalem? I don't think that's what he meant. I think what he's referring to is, well, you could say it this way. I think he's talking about heaven. Now, of course, there's all kinds of ideas that flood into our head when we use that word. And really, I think a lot of the imagery that we have of heaven falls pretty flat. But if you think of it along these terms, this is where we are with him. We are with Jesus. Someone once said, I would rather be in hell with Jesus than in heaven without him. And that's an interesting way of considering this. And that's actually quite powerful if you think about it. Because it really kind of changes what it is that we're talking about. Because again, when we talk about heaven as this like magnificent place, I don't think we're going to really give a rip about a lot of these extra things. You know, they talk about streets of gold and mansions and all these things. is Jesus there? Is the Father there? Then that's where I want to be. That's where I want to be. And that's where Jesus desires for us to be. As Charles Spurgeon once said, love always cries, nearer, nearer. There is this desire that is manifest in Jesus that he deeply longs to be with us, so that where he is, there we may be also. And this might be reminding you of the passage in John 14, because it sounds very much the same. I go to prepare a place for you. Right? He said, in my Father's house are many dwellings. The King James says many mansions. And I go there to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, there you may be also. Again, this present tense, where I am. And that's very fascinating, because Jesus was right there in front of them. But yet, he was also unified and one with the Father. He was with the Father. And so there was this discussion among the disciples that followed, like, how can we know where you're going? And they were missing the point. This is where he tells them, they're asking, well, show us the way. And he said, have you not known me? and he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am this. Jesus is the embodiment of, he is. He's the presence of God, but it's the presence of God that has come near to us, that has come to us so that we can know him. Famous passage, Psalm 23 and verse 6. It says, surely goodness and mercy, which is hesed, by the way, for those of you who are scholars there. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and what? And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is the hope. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. God with us. And this is what he himself longs for. In 1 John, sorry, I'm jumping around a lot of passages this morning, but this is so good. 1 John chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, see how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called the children of God, and such we are. For this reason the world does not know us, because it did not know him. Beloved, now we are the children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him as he is. And everyone who has this hope fixed on him purifies himself just as he is pure. What manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called the sons of God. That's incredible. That's incredible. This is, as best as we can define it, this is heaven. This is heaven, to be unified with the Father. And then he goes on here in verse 24 of John 17. Let me just read the whole thing together and we'll continue with it. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, be with me where I am, so that they may see my glory which you have given me. For you loved me before the foundation of the world. The glory of Jesus. Now the word glory, it has to do with substance. It really means weightiness. And Jesus here is asking and he's praying for those who belong to him to be shown his glory, that we would see his glory. Why? So that we, as is stated in 1 John, now are we children of God, and it has not yet appeared what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him as he is. So seeing Jesus as he is. And we know that in the incarnation, when Jesus took on flesh, what he was doing was he was veiling his glory. He was veiling it. And so not everyone that looked at Jesus was floored by the fact that he is God. As a matter of fact, when you read through the Gospels, there are times when you find I'm going to say, kind of the ordinariness of Jesus, and it strikes us. He got tired. He got hungry. All of these very human things because he was absolutely human. But there are moments when people saw Jesus for who he was. And there's some very specific moments when this is actually intentionally revealed. And I'm thinking of the transfiguration. First of all, we're going to look at this passage, but remember, whenever Moses prayed for something, he prayed that he could see the glory of the Father. He asked God, he said, I pray you, show me your glory. And this is in Exodus. I don't know if I jotted the reference down here. Yes, Exodus 33. But Moses himself prays to see the glory of God. And what was God's response to him? Effectively, it was, you can't. You can't. It would kill you. But what he does do, he kind of tucks Moses away in the cleft of this rock. And then he says that he's going to pass by, and then he's going to allow Moses to see him, see his back almost as he passes by. And he does this, and from this, Moses' face, just from seeing the back of God, so to speak, as he passed by, Moses' face was brilliant and was glowing from just that glimpse of the presence of God. And he was told he needed to veil that, he needed to cover it. He needed to cover it so that as that faded, the people did not see it fading. And so he was told to cover that, to cover his face. If you would turn to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 9. This is incredible, this as we refer to it as the transfiguration. This is where the veil is pulled back a bit with Jesus. Luke chapter 9. It's also found in, I believe, Matthew and Mark. But we're going to look at it specifically here in Luke's gospel. Luke 9, verses 28 to 36. Let me just read this. Some 8 days after these things, he took along Peter and John and James and went up on the mount to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, and they were fully awake. They saw his glory, and the 2 men standing with him. And as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not realizing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid, and they entered the cloud. Then a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. They were given a glimpse of the glory of Jesus. The veil, so to speak, was pulled back for a moment, and they got to see and experience who Jesus was, and the glory as of that of the Father. And one fascinating thing here, Moses and Elijah appeared there, and they're with Jesus, and they're talking. First of all, as an aside, this is kind of interesting. How did they know? How did Peter, James, and John know who they were? You ever think about that? Did they recognize him? Did they say, "Oh, I've got a picture of you in my Bible, and this is what you look like"? No. There would have been no way from appearance, but there was, and I think it was a kind of a supernatural realization or a knowing that they recognized them. And I was once asked by someone who, actually this was someone who years ago was in my youth group who had lost a loved one. And she asked me, she said, "Are we going to recognize people in heaven?" And I thought, looking at this passage and some others, I thought, yes, I think absolutely we will. Not only are we going to recognize people we know, I think we're going to recognize people that we didn't know. I think when we see Abraham, we're going to say that's Abraham. When we see Moses, we're going to know. There's going to be a knowledge there that far surpasses just you see somebody that you recognize. But here, what are they talking about? What are they talking about? It says that, "And there were Moses and Elijah, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem." Does anybody's translation use a different word other than departure? I'm curious, because the word there is the same word for Exodus. Now that's interesting, because when you read it this way, his departure that he is about to accomplish, that doesn't seem, how is departing accomplishing anything? Jesus is about to lead an exodus in Jerusalem. And that has to, if that causes us to hearken back to the Exodus account, how was it that the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt? What was the last plague? Well, it was Passover, right? It was the execution of this lamb and his blood being spread on the lintel and doorpost. Jesus is about to lead an exodus in Jerusalem. His exodus. That's fascinating. That's fascinating. But here, they get a glimpse of his glory. And this is what we are not only called to, but what Jesus has prepared beforehand for us. That we would take part in this glory that is his, that he is sharing it with us. And throughout both the Old and New Testament, there's imagery used of God's people being his spouse, being married to him. And in that imagery, when you think about that, that means that whatever is rightfully in possession of him is conferred to us. It's given to us. We get to take part in it. If you marry someone that's wealthy, guess what? That's yours as well. You join in together. Right? And there is something about this, Jesus paying the cost, whatever it took, to welcome all of us into his glory. And he absolutely didn't have to do that. Why did he do it? This was his desire. This is what he wanted. It was inside of him that he would share this, that he would not just keep it for himself, but that he would welcome in anyone who is willing to come in and take this invitation. And as we close this morning, I want you to think about this. And actually turn to the last passage we're going to look at is Revelation 21. This is the hope. This is the ultimate goal, and this is where this is headed. And this is where, thankfully, not only what Jesus was praying for, but what he is in his selflessness was willing to purchase and accomplish for us. Let me read Revelation 21, verses 21 to 27. It says, "And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each one of the gates was a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God has illumined it. And its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime, for there will be no night there. Its gates will never be closed, and they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. And nothing unclean, and no one who is practicing abominations and lying shall even come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life." The light, the glory that will illuminate this new Jerusalem is, what does it say? The lamp is the Lamb, where the light itself will come forth from Jesus. And the magnificent thing, there's so many wild things when you read through the book of Revelation, but one of the magnificent things that is made apparent is when John is given a vision of the throne, right? Not that dissimilar from the throne that Isaiah saw. What does he see on the throne? He sees a lamb that has been slain. And this glorification of Jesus referred to his glorification, and he linked it with his crucifixion, which is unbelievable. That he would be lifted up. And this is where we could say the veil is torn. The veil is torn. Now we know what actually happened. There was an earthquake and the veil was torn. What veil was that? Well, the veil that separated in the temple, that separated from the outer portion of the temple to the Holy of Holies. This is where the near presence of God was. The veil was torn as Jesus is dying on the cross because his veil was torn, this flesh, this body. And what did we see? Well, for most people, when they saw that was, if you were to ever witness a crucifixion, it would make you sick. What did those of faith, what they saw in that, and Paul expresses this, many others express this, but he says, may I never boast, or he uses the word, may I never glory in anything except the cross of Jesus Christ. This is it. This is where God allowed himself to be torn to pieces so that the world might see who he is. And he did this, why? Well, his desire was for his glory to be shared with those who believe. And he was willing to, in a small way, Isaiah said, "Here I am, send me." It was a small reflection of what Jesus was doing. Here I am, send me. There is this need between God and man, and he was willing to step into this place, the only one who could, to step into this place and bring people unto himself. And in so doing, in this veiled humanity, I love the Christmas hymn. One of the lines, I forget which one it is. I always forget this. But it's veiled, the line is, veiled in flesh the Godhead see. What was concealing the glory of Jesus actually was the thing, his flesh, that made it manifest to us. And it was such a magnificent thing because it was veiled but yet because of that veiling, we could peer into the heart of the Father through this veiling, and it's unbelievable. And this is Jesus' prayer for you and me. Let us join together as we close the service then in prayer with this thought in mind, that it was his desire that led him to the cross and that led him to take on flesh and bring us back to himself. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we are in awe of who you are and what you are willing to do for us and what you did do, what you have accomplished for us. And even now, as you continue to intercede on our behalf, you continue to present yourself to the Father on our behalf. And it's such a magnificent thing that this originated in the very mind of yourself from eternity past, that you would be willing to take on humanity and to purchase us back to yourself. And I thank you so much for that. I ask that this would be a reality for us, and that it would not depart from us, but that we would continue to consider ourselves in this place of being unified and being welcomed into your family as your bride. As we look forward to this glory that you have in and of yourself and that you are sharing with us. And these things I pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen.